being here. I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Iris Montero as our speaker today. Iris completed her PhD here at Cambridge in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science, and is now assistant professor in the Department of Hispanic Studies at Brown University. Iris is a cultural historian of early modern science and medicine, working on European, Latin American, and indigenous traditions of natural knowledge production. Her current book, project, What the Hummingbird Knows, A Natural History, centers the elasticity of the early modern genre of natural history to trace transfers of knowledge between the Americas and Europe, focusing on indigenous agency. Her research has been supported by the Mexican Council of Science and Technology, the Brockman Foundation, the Gates Cambridge Trust, and the Andrew Mellon Foundation. She was a member of the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton in the fall of 2021, and invited researcher at the Center Alexandre Coiré in Paris in the spring of 2022. She's currently an invited researcher at the Consejo Superior de Investigaciones Científicas in Madrid, so she's coming from Madrid now. And today she will be presenting the talk entitled Back to the Amphibious Future, Axolotl's Potentialities Between Mexican Science Fiction and Indigenous Storytelling. Please join me in welcoming Iris.
Thank you everybody for being here. Thank you Stephanie for that lovely introduction. And thank you also to Rosanna Lent and to Adrian Lerner for making this seminar happen. And also to some of my fellow HPS PhD students who are here today, and some of my former mentors and colleagues. It's really just a joy to be back. As Stephanie said, I've been in a Spanish-speaking environment for 6 months, and this hadn't happened in 20 years. And so my English is particularly rusty, and for that I apologize. This weekend I've been feeling that it's definitely gone to the back of my head. So if there's any diction issues, if there are any things you don't understand, please don't hesitate to ask, and I can repeat. And it'll be fine. I'm presenting today a work that is very much in progress. It's in a way a spin-off of my first book project on the hummingbird, and it's a product really of a series of events that have happened since I was last at Cambridge. A lot has happened since then, but one of the most joyful developments has been to join a literary department where I get to live and teach amazing stories, for a living, which is a tremendous opportunity. And through that process of starting to teach literature, I've come across sources that I would have not come across before, and one of them is a particular set of science fiction short stories that I will be talking about today. But my approach will, as with my previous work, entail always a connection with those pre-Columbian and early colonial sources from Mexico, with a focus on trying to understand what indigenous actors have known about animals, how they have known animals, how they have preserved that knowledge, and what of that knowledge has reached us, and in which way. So let me take you to Mexico City, which many of you might know, a place that before the arrival of the Spaniards was a city on the lake. In this very famous rendition of the place, published in Nuremberg, accompanying Cortez's second letter, we see it just as such, a city on the lake, inspired on Venice, and this is how Cortez describes it. And it's, in a very European style, although we now know that this image is actually pretty much based on indigenous sources as well. We see how it is a Lacostrian ecosystem that, is giving home to this aquatic metropolis, as John Lopez has termed it. Recently, science fiction has gone back to the idea that this is a city on the lake, and has imagined that in the future Mexico City will come back to being an aquatic environment, only this time under the water of a lake. Science fiction writer Andrea Chapela, whom we will be talking about today, imagines that it will rain every day and every night, and it will rain months and months and days and years, and that one of the largest cities in the world will be underwater again. And here we see the cover of her book and can very economically see what the vision of this city would be. Many of you might identify that Ángel de la Independencia that crowns Paseo de la Reforma, now floating around in this place. And here, but regardless of the lake coming back in some ways, the creature that convinces today, the axolotl, is no longer in the picture. So in a couple of these short stories by Andrea Chapela, the hummingbird has, Freudian lapsus, the axolotl is extinct, is now extinct. After a long literary life in works by Julio Cortázar, Salvador Elizondo, and Juan José Arreola, or Roger Bartlett, to name but the most prominent, the axolotl in science fiction is apparently a memory, drawing on a wall, is graffiti on a fence, it's paper. And at the same time that we're starting to get these stories, the axolotl has literally become paper and is circulated from hand to hand in the form of a new banknote, a somewhat belated effort to raise awareness about its endangered status in the wild. The axolotl is portrayed here in the canals of Xochimilco, the only lacustrine space that remains out of that complex system of lakes currently, and where this animal is endemic to. And what that means, to be endemic from a place, means that this axolotl, this animal has not lived and does not live, cannot live anywhere else in the wild. This animal is, in fact, a product of a very particular process of evolution of this place onto a highly unusual equestrian landscape, 2,000 meters above sea level, with highly biodiverse pockets of fresh water. The axolotl is therefore profoundly entangled with its environment and with its histories, and that is what I would like to be talking about today. Perhaps echoing the return to the lacustrine city that we saw in that cover of Chapela's science fiction book, the banknote design portrays the axolotl on the back of the symbol of Mexico Tenochtitlan as at its foundation on Lake Texcoco, where we see the famous eagle atop a cactus. In this case, a rendition from the Teocalli de la Guerra Sagrada, one of the first archaeological pieces that portray this symbol, and invites us to revisit its role in this initial moment, in this foundation, a role that is all but forgotten, but that I will argue today is quite central to the axolotl's survival. So what I want to do today is to talk about the potential of recovering the conditions that make the axolotl's life possible in its habitat, in an interplay between the distant past and the perhaps not so distant future. I'm doing this by putting in dialogue two genres that do not often speak to each other, contemporary science fiction and ancient indigenous storytelling. More specifically, I take Andrea Chapela's short stories as a window into foundational narratives about Mexico City and its amphibious beginnings in indigenous storytelling. I will be looking at how the axolotl lives at the heart of the lake, en el corazón del lago, what we would say in Nahuatl, in jiolloco, in the middle of the water. In Chapela's writing, as well as in Nahua manuscripts, such as the Florentine Codex and the Codex Aubin. And I will argue that the Axolotl epitomizes an understanding of life between land and water that was central to the city's founding. As in my previous work, my approach seeks to write animal histories that follow the actual animal and that ask, what does this animal know and what does it hide about itself and also about the people who interact with it? Looking at context of colonization, I'm particularly interested in what indigenous communities know about animals and how they know it. But most importantly, I'm interested in how they preserve this knowledge and what echoes of this knowledge has beyond these indigenous communities. To answer my questions, I combine the history of science, in particular global histories of knowledge, ethnohistory with a focus on linguistic and visual analysis, and literary studies, in particular animal studies and translation studies. Today, I will deploy my argument in 3 parts. Firstly, I will briefly introduce Chapela's short stories and her post-diluvian vision of the city and the Axolotl. Secondly, I will discuss how the Florentine Codex and the Codex Aubin, these 2 16th century indigenous manuscripts, show how the Axolotl lives at the center of the lake, in what way and what can we discern from that. And thirdly, I will present a possibility for Nahua translation analysis and make a reading of both Chapela and the Codice's keywords to see how they present particular amphibious pairings. This is what I will be trying to suggest to you, where there is potential for a future for this animal, even in one of the most deteriorated environments today. But before we turn to the first section, I would just like to remind you a few facts about our protagonist. And many of you might know much more than me about its actual habits of life, but I would just like to put some of them on the table. Mexican axolotls, the Ambystoma mexicanum, they are amphibians. They're specifically salamanders, but who remain in a larval state. That is, they do not go through metamorphosis and are able to reproduce, retaining their juvenile body all their life. Their name comes from Nahuatl, the most widely spoken indigenous language in Mexico, and means water dog or water monster. There is some discussion about that. They can measure up to 30 centimeters in length and can weigh up to 200 grams. Their skin is slippery, it's soft, it's jelly-like, and it's somewhat permeable, which makes them tremendously vulnerable to pollution in the water. They have these prominent gills. That's probably the most noticeable characteristic, and occasionally emerge from their preferred site at the bottom of the lake to take a breath. But they generally remain underwater. They have quite nocturnal habits, and they are quite shy. They don't like being looked at. They like to remain at the bottom of the lake, and in fact they like to bury themselves in mud. They like to be right under there, cool, in the dark. They must be introverts. Their coloration in the wild is this grayish green, but there are also hypermelanistic axolotls that can be purple, almost black, and there are also leucistic axolotls that are pink or kind of peachy yellow, and that abound, especially in captivity, through inbreeding. This, that is not the wild type of axolotl. This is one. This is the one that used to inhabit these lakes in abundance. They can live up to 20 years in optimal conditions. In captivity, axolotls have a robust population, both in laboratories and in the aquarium trade, and there has been great research on this from the history of science perspective by Chris Rice and others about the importance of this animal in setting up what we know now as the aquarium, and place that is between exhibition and research and and of course is one of the most prominent animals today in scientific research about tissue regeneration and other areas. Although one of the issues with this captivity population, this population in captivity, is that it has very little genetic diversity, and that's one of the worrying elements about it. In the wild, by contrast, their population has decreased alarmingly in the 21st century. A decade ago, which was when the last count was made by the National University of Mexico, there were only 35 axolotls per square kilometer in the Xochimilco wetlands. This is down from thousands that were found in the 90s in that same space. So pollution, urbanization, the introduction of species like the carp and the tilapia that both compete for food and eat their eggs have made life nearly impossible for them in the wild. They're in really critical condition. This precarious fate is captured in Andrea Chapela's collection, a book called Ansibles Perfiladores y otras máquinas de ingenio, published in 2020, which compiles 10 short stories where various technologies are interfaces between humans and govern or dictate human relationships. In this book, the axolotl has basically ceased to exist as a living being, a slippery creature. It has become, as I said at the beginning, a drawing, a painting, a nostalgic image. In the first short story that I will discuss very briefly, that's titled 90% Real, 90% Real, this story takes place during a broken day, un día roto, in which the protagonist, a young professional woman recovering from a bad breakup, gets to see the imperfect urban reality, usually covered by a curtain of virtual reality. So just for this day, she can go out and see what is really out there, something that is not possible in common days, only in these broken days. In this window into real reality, the axolotl appears as a multicolored graffiti on a wall, visible from the light train that she takes at Estadio Azteca station, el tren ligero. The protagonist thinks, its pink gills stand up like a punk hairstyle, and it smiles with a childish face. The virtual reality of the curtain creates a mirage of a neat city that usually hides everything unpleasing to the eye, including smog, rubbish accumulated in the gutters, and also graffiti. But the protagonist misses the axolotl and wants to keep seeing it, painted on the wall even after fixing the glitch of the virtual curtain. It is so beautiful. I'm going to change my filter settings so that I can see it when the curtain comes back up. The narrative voice reminds us that a few years ago, a conservationist group took it as a symbol. Although it is not spelled out fully, it is intuited that the salamander remained an emblem of conservation and did not make it. The second short story, in which I will be more focused on, is titled Como quien oye llover. And here I'm showing you, the image of the first publication of this story. Came up in Revistas de País together with this illustration by the author's cousin, who's an amazing artist. And that can give you an idea of the type of register this short story is written in. Como quien oye llover is a tale that is set in a post-diluvian future in which a storm that lasted, as I said, months and months and years, completely flooded the city center and transformed it back into a lake, the primordial home of the axolotls we have established. In this neo-lacustrine environment, the protagonists Axolotl and Esme, two teenagers about to finish high school and embarking on very dissimilar futures, explore the magnetic heart of the lake, the area where once stood the center of the pre-Hispanic city and also the 20th century metropolis, crowned by the Palacio de Bellas Artes, which is in the story kind of the aim of all of their desire and their wish to go explore and see for themselves this recreated post-Diluvian place. It is also there that in the last 3 floors of the old department store that stands just across from the Palacio de Bellas Artes, a place that many of you might recognize as Sears, this cafeteria, are now on the wall paintings by different artists, and one of them is a little axolotl swimming. Next to the axolotl, there are also pictures of the city by night, an image that generations of people have not seen because the city no longer shines. There are no lights at night. It's completely underwater. So even if it's not entirely spelled out, the fact that the axolotl swimming, the drawing of an axolotl swimming is juxtaposed to this image of the city by night suggests that there too the axolotl no longer is. But this futuristic vision holds also interesting clues about the deeper past. In the rest of the collection of short stories, since there are 10 short stories, the technologies used by the author to connect her characters include ansibles, for example, an interesting wing to Ursula Le Guin, profilers, a sensorial curtain, as we discussed, a pink bracelet that can modify minds, pasts, and intentions, a frequencer to read minds, to name but a few. But here in this short story, the technology in place is an indigenous technology. It's the chinampa, that again, many of you will be familiar with. One of the characters, Axolotl, who grew up in a chinampa, is very committed to its reintroduction, and it's hoping to stay in Mexico City, go to university, study environmental engineering, and come up with solutions to multiply the chinampa and bring that model back. To her, to the protagonist, the reuse of chinampas, and according Chapela, is the most important breakthrough in the last decades and represents the future she envisions. To take an Aztec design and through new technology improve it to reintegrate it into the environment. This is Axolotl's dream and aspiration. But what is a chinampa? And again, I apologize if this is obvious for many of you, but in case it isn't, the chinampa consists of several layers of vegetation and sludge to produce an organic soil 50 centimeters above water level for agricultural use in wetlands. These are rectangular plots surrounded by water. They are roughly 5 to 10 meters wide and 50 to 100 meter long. Usually the chinampa is secured on the edges by trees whose roots hold the soil. And when a significant number of chinampas are built, they make a network of canals that can be used for navigation purposes. So this is a model taken from a paper describing the exact mechanism of how a chinampa works. We have other renditions of chinampas, and one that is particularly moving and comes from perhaps the earliest map of Mexico City that we have, the so-called Uppsala map, because it is there in Uppsala, and that gives us an idea of how complex that ecosystem was and how those nature cultures around the lake functioned. To give you just a couple of examples, here we see of course fishermen, we see a combination of plants and birds. We see also the dam that was built to separate fresh and salt water in the lake, And just the level of detail that this map contains tells us a lot about the lived experience of people there and the use of natural resources. And in particular, for our purposes, we see that Chinampa here. We see how these are still, the wetlands. There's still a boat here, but there are plants planted here, and we know that because very clearly we see a chile drawn there, and this is a place where chile is being grown, right in the middle of the lake, right on top of it. So this is the heart of the lake. This is where everything happened. This is where life was produced through very complex technologies like this one. And interestingly, coming back to Chapela's short story, this notion of the heart of the lake is something that she uses as well in her text. There are 12 mentions of the heart of the lake, el corazón del lago, of that phrase. This is where anything important is happening between the two characters. They meet on a chinampa on a dry day, and they like each other. They have this erotic tension, and one is about to leave. Nesmi is about to leave to study art in Colorado, while Axolotl, as we said, was going to stay in Mexico City and study environmental engineering. So there's this pressure to do something. What they decide to do is to go together to the heart of the lake, to this site that I described, to see the Palacio de Bellas Artes, to understand or see what was left of that, which basically, as she described, she could only see the cupulas of the palace. But the place is at the center of their connection and their desire to the desire for each other, and the desire to imagine a certain type of future, right? When I read that bit, when I noticed that this phrase was present 12 times in this short story, that rang a bell. Because from my own training in colonial Latin America, I could recognize that phrase. That is a notion that is used in many, many ways in different texts. And I would like to talk about two of them that are quite central to the story. So now we're moving to the 16th century, going back in time. The first one is the Florentine Codex, that is basically an encyclopedia inspired by Pliny's natural history and organized in 12 books. And book 11, the second to last book, except for the book on the conquest, is focused on natural things. It's focused on, as they called, earthly things. And it is there that we find this notion of at the heart of the lake very prominently. One of the instances in which we find it is the entry on the atotolin, which is, we think, the pelican. And this is an entry that a lot of us in this field have been discussing lately, including Marcy Norton and Kelly McDonough, because we know that there's something really important and unique in Book 11 happening in this entry. So this entry describes the atotolin, this water bird, that has amazing powers. It has a power to summon the winds. It has a power to attract other birds. It decides when all the other birds should come. It has a power to turn boats. It has a power to decide when it will be hunted and how, and the fate of the hunter as well. At some point, the authors of the text call the animal itself the heart of the lagoon. It lives at the heart of the lagoon, but it is also the heart of the lagoon. And for our purposes, I'm interested in how this animal is not alone at the heart of the lagoon. It is accompanied by an axolotl and a snake. In my previous work, I have discussed the notion of disguise in the Florentine Codex as one of the mechanisms for indigenous agency to permeate this very European text in terms of its design and its structure. And here I think we see another instance in which, besides the entry on the axolotl that does exist, it's a very formulaic entry in the text and just describes its morphology, says that it's very tasty and that it's commonly eaten. We find it very well drawn here. That is not the case with the original entry, and the entry is not as well designed as it's here. We see it as being one with the water. This is so hard to recognize that it's not even indexed in the digital version of the Florentine Codex that came up very recently. It's hard to see. And it is, as you say, painted exactly in the tones of the water, probably suggesting that it's under the mud and it's really not, desiring to be seen. It's completely camouflaged. So we have something happening here that includes creatures that are coexisting in this habitat, that are important to the humans around them, as we saw in the Uppsala map, and that somehow consider the axolotl quite important in this story, even if it's not spelled out in the text. But there are other texts that do spell out why the axolotl is important at the heart of the lake. And now I'm turning to the Codex Aubin. The Codex Aubin has a very complicated genealogy, and I'm not going to go into too much detail. I just want to point out how it belongs to a family of texts that have been copied between them, and that, in some cases include a particular version of the foundational story of Mexico City that other texts do not include. Here, these three manuscripts at the center, the Aubin, which is at the British Museum, and also two manuscripts that are at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, do have this alternative version of the foundation of Mexico City. That has, in my argument, a very amphibious nature. And here I will turn to the rendition of that story. Just want to show you how these two manuscripts look. And just by looking at them, you might be able to tell that this is a more complex story than we usually know and remember. So the traditional story of the foundation of Mexico City is that there are migrating tribes who come from the north, and they have been traveling for over 150 years. Sometimes it is more, and then at some point they see the sign where they are supposed to stop, and that sign is an eagle atop a cactus. That we know. It's so famous that it's in the flag, it's in the shield, it's everywhere. But there is a second chapter to this story that has been forgotten, and that is present in these 2 or 3 manuscripts, and it is that bit here. What happens here is that the migrants arrive at the border of the lake and they stop. But one of them, whose name is Axolohua, you can already tell that kind of sounds familiar. His name is the Lord of the Axolotl, dives in. He gets into the lake, disappears. For a couple of days, everybody thinks he has already died, but then re-emerges. And when he comes out, he says he's bringing a message from Tlaloc, from the water deity, the ancestral water deity, the oldest deity in the Mesoamerican pantheon. And Tlaloc says that he agrees that these newcomers from the north can settle there, and he gives his blessing that he is agreeing to rule together with their deity, with the migrant god Huitzilopochtli. This chapter, I'm just showing you here how the manuscript looks in more detail. It's a very different version, complements the kind of the half that we have received. and makes the history of the foundation very different. It makes it a story of earth and water. I would like to briefly read you, and this is very convoluted English, but tell you what the text is in the Codex Aubin, so that you have a sense of how this story was captured. Let me just get my paper because this will be easier. They walked for 196 years. Axolohua and also the one called Coatl both went. They went in search. They went to enter among the reeds. There is a prickly pear on which is perched an eagle. At the foot of it, it's a nest. Its bed, all the different, at its bed, there are all the different fine feathers of the red bird, of the blue bird, all the precious feathers. Feathers always imply preciousness, value. And then comes along a man called Coatl, and his name means eagle serpent. Then he tells them, the water that we have come to see is like blue ink. But there they submerged Axolohua, the lord of the Axolotl. And when they have submerged Axolohua, right away Coatl returned. So he went to say to his companions, there died Axolohua, since they submerged him there where we saw among the reeds a prickly pear. It's a little repetitive. Coatl informed his people of this, but on the next day, Axolohua came out. Then he said to his companions, since I went to see Tlaloc, since he called me, he told me, my son Huitzilopochtli has arrived, the migrant deity that accompanied the migrants, and his house shall be here. He shall dedicate it here because we shall live united on the earth. So this is a more complex story, right? That we have received. This, if we take the figure of Axolohua and his function in this, completes a very amphibian notion of this ancestral story that somehow has not reached us, that we have forgotten in some way. And here is where I would like to move on to a suggestion for how to incorporate some of the notions that we find in this story in trying to recover the conditions to imagine a possible future, a potential future for the Axolotl. And we're moving on to the third section now. One of the main tools that we have to study this text is translation, analysis. And here again, I'm combining what I see in both the text of Chapela and the two codices to suggest that there's something interesting going on with the names of the characters. And this is something that is very common in Nahuatl writings. There is always a very dual notion about the language. There is always a notion of symmetry. One of the key concepts that we see in Nahuatl text is the famous difrasismo, the idea that two phrases juxtaposed create another type of meaning. And here I think something similar is happening with the choice of names for these characters. And I want to focus on the two protagonists of this last scene that I described from the Codex Aubin, Axolohua and Coatl. So as we established already, Axolohua is the lord of the Axolotl, and his name comes from the animal itself, which itself comes from water and servant or page or dog or monster. I mean, here there is a lot of discussion on what exactly it means. And then Wa is a possessive. So Axolohua literally is the lord of the Axolotl. And Coatl is literally the juxtaposition of these two animal names. It's, we could say it's another version of the feathered serpent of Quetzalcoatl. It's another complex creature that is part bird and part serpent. And it's definitely an earthy, it has earthy connotations. Now, I see something very similar happening in Andrea Chapela's short stories and her choice of names for her two protagonists, Axolotl and Nesmi. Axolotl is probably very clear to you. She's a water flower from Atl and Xochitl. And Nesmi is more complex, and there are various possible readings. Sofia Mateos Gomez, in a really interesting article on science fiction and Mexico City, suggests that this could be modernization of the verb nemi, which means to live, to dwell, to be, to go around. I suggest that it might be something different, maybe closer to nanemi, thinking possibly of nesmi as to nes plus me, and that would give us something even more accurate to the type of experiences that the character is going through. Nanemi means to go along, to walk, to wander. And let's remember that this is the character who's about to leave Mexico City, who's going abroad to study art, and who will wander and explore the world. Andrea Chapela closes her story with the following passage. They say that dry knives are full of possibilities and that those who write their names will meet again. That is exactly what happens at the last scene of the short story. Remember, we were describing where the Axolotl is in the short story. It is a painting on a wall at the cafeteria across from the Palacio de Bellas Artes that is all submerged in water and you can only approach it by boat. And right there, their names are written on the wall, Axolotl and Nesmi. The possibility of meeting again. What if, besides Nesmi and Axolotl, who we want to imagine will meet again in this post-diluvian future that Chapela paints for us, also Axolohua and Cuauhcoatl could meet again? What if earth and water in this place, in Xochimilco, could actually be reunited in the consciousness of people who live there, leaving behind the very automatic choice to desiccate this place, to make it a dry land? What if that combination, that possibility of this juxtaposition of energies meeting again could take us back to a potential amphibious future? This new banknote, if seen through the lens of indigenous storytelling, could help us imagine other possibilities, I think, other possible relationships that are ancestral to the wetlands of Mexico City. To see now this Axolotl next to the symbol of the Tocali de la Guerra Sagrada, through the lens of the Codex Aubin, could help us read this banknote in a very different way. This has been a controversial object in circulation, partly because axolotls have created such an obsession that everybody's keeping the banknotes. They're not really circulating, nobody wants to give them away. And in her very recent and very insightful book, Caroline Vornoff has suggested that the banknote can actually be detrimental to the survival of the axolotl, because it is giving people the impression that it is fine, that it is around, that it is present, and that just like it has happened with the ancient material remains of indigenous culture, it is in the past. It belongs to the past, and in her opinion, this juxtaposition is sending that message. I suggest there are other possible ways to read it, and that if we take into account the narrative of Axolohua and the original notion of the sea as an amphibian space, we can animate this very prosaic object and try to find in it a possibility of hope. And it seems that there is hope. I want to refer now to one of the long-lasting and really intense laboring projects trying to save the axolotl, the Proyecto Chinampa Refugio. It's organized by various bodies, but mostly lodged at UNAM. And it's trying to connect with chinamperos, with local farmers in the region of Xochimilco, with the objective of recreating the chinampa, just like Axolotl is trying to do, with the understanding that that is the only way to save the axolotl. It needs to have its habitat rejuvenated. The reconstruction of chinampas and the reintroduction of wild axolotls is starting to happen. This is a very slow process, but in the last 18 months, the first axolotls, wild-type axolotls that were removed from the lake, kept in captivity to be safe, have now been reintroduced in the lake. 12 of them. One died within a month. The oxygenation levels of the lake are not optimal. There is the need to bring oxygen there, but the space that the new chinampas have created with these natural filters to keep the water clean are apparently working. It's a tiny beginning, some say is a Quixotesque enterprise, but it might ignite the imagination to make amphibians feel at home again, potentially.